This video is for biology for health science majors. We're still in Unit 1. This is the third video for Unit 1. We are on evolution. To talk about evolution, we have to talk about DNA first. So DNA is the blueprint for physical and behavioral features. Yes, even behavioral, because our emotions and our reactions are generated by chemical signals that flow through the body, like hormones, neurotransmitters, nerve impulses, right? These are all physical processes that are encoded in this blueprint, our genetic blueprint. Now, all forms of life use DNA as the code for life. And that all life uses DNA as the code for life is one line of evidence that we are linked to a common ancestor. All life on this planet is linked to a common ancestor. There's no law that we know of that states that a genetic code has to be using this particular molecule with these particular rules for expression. Yet we see this is common to all life on the planet. Now, it is possible life arose more than once, and just coincidentally, all lineages use the exact same molecules to code for life, but it seems kind of unlikely, and other lines of evidence suggest a single lineage encompassing all life on Earth as well. For example, there are a number of enzymes, which are little molecular machines encoded by your DNA. And there's a number of these enzymes that are essential for life, and they are nearly identical across all kingdoms, from humans to fish to insects to single-celled bacteria. And so this suggests that we had a common ancestor, and we were, once upon a time, all life on Earth had essentially the same genetic message, and then it diversified from there, but we still have remnants of that common ancestry living within us, or those clues within us. Now, the diversity of all life on Earth arises from differences in our DNA sequences, and the relatedness of all life on Earth can be determined by similarities compared to the differences in the code, okay? So just as you can determine how closely related you are to another human being by how similar your DNA code is to theirs, we do this for paternity testing and other kinds of tests to determine degrees of ancestral relatedness with your spouse or your partner. Like you could go to ancestry.com, you can send in a little sample to them. They extract the DNA and they can tell you what group of people you're most related to by, they can tell you about your heritage using your DNA. So just as you can determine how closely related you are to other humans by how similar your DNA code is to theirs, so can you determine the degree of relatedness with other animals by similarities in that DNA code, okay? It's just about how far back you're looking, right? The more similar the code, the more closely related to individuals, right? And this is because DNA is passed from parents to offspring. It's copied from your parents to you. And occasionally it's passed along with some copy errors called mutations. So the more distantly related two individuals are, the more mutations the more mutations you'll find that cause their DNA to differ. So if you're inheriting DNA from your parents, your DNA is going to be very similar to theirs. And if you're comparing your DNA to your sibling, it's going to be your DNA is going to be very similar because you both inherited your DNA from the same people. But if you compare your DNA to your third cousin and you share great-great-great-grandparents, the DNA has had a little more time to change, and so it might be a little bit more different, and so on, further back to more distant ancestry. So let's take a look at this. Here's 4 different species W, X, Y, and Z. And here is a segment of their genetic code. And you can line these segments up, and you can look at how they're the same in some places and how they're different in other places. And you can count up the similarities and count up the differences to see who's more related to who, all right? Just like you would with humans. So you have, here you have species W and species Z. Their DNA codes are very similar, which means they have a very a very recent common ancestor. Species X and species Y, their genetic codes are very similar, so they have a very recent common ancestor. Species W and species X their DNA codes were more dissimilar. So they have a more distant common ancestor. And again, a good analogy would be with parents versus grandparents versus great-grandparents. So species W and species Z are going to be a little bit like siblings. They have more similar DNA because their common ancestor is recent. You and your sibling, your common ancestor is only one generation ago, so your DNA is going to be very similar. Versus you and your second cousin, where you still have a common ancestor, but that common ancestor isn't your parents, it isn't your grandparents, it's your great-grandparents. So that common ancestor is farther away, so you're going to have more dissimilarities in your genetic code. Okay? So to find the common ancestor between you and your cousin, you'll have to go back farther to your grandparents. Second cousin, you'll have to go back even farther. For your neighbor down the street, you also have a common ancestor, but you're going to have to go back even farther to find who it is. So if you go back far enough, you'll find common ancestry between you and everything else on this planet. And it's all recorded in your DNA. Your DNA is like tracks in the sand, right? And so you can follow those tracks backwards to figure out where we came from and what path we took through time. I like to think of our DNA as a molecular message encoded, it's a message encoded in a molecular language. So instead of a written message, it's a molecular message. We don't literally have A's and G's and T's in our genetic code, right? We have molecules. Those are just letters to symbolize a molecule. There's 4 molecules that make up the genetic code, and they're arranged in different ways to make words. And having babies is a bit like a game of Whisper Down the Lane, or maybe you grew up calling it telephone. In Whisper Down the Lane, a person starts a message and whispers it to their neighbor, who passes the message to their neighbor, who passes the message to their neighbor, and so on and so forth. Just as your grandparents passed their DNA to your parents, who passed their DNA to you, and you may have or may one day pass that genetic message to your offspring. So in Whisper Down the Lane, people make mistakes sometimes as they pass the message, sometimes a person doesn't speak very clearly, or a person listening gets, they hear it wrong. And so the message changes as it gets passed down the lane. So 2 people who are very separated in the whisper chain receive very different messages because the message has had more time to mutate or change between them. At the end, when the final person in the chain announces the message they received, and the first person in the chain reveals what message they started, everybody laughs at the unexpected, silly ways the message was repeated, the message changed, as it was passed along. Just from simple errors made as people repeated it. And this is very similar to reproduction. In reproduction, mistakes are sometimes made when copying DNA to the next generation. When DNA changes because it's not copied quite right, we call this a mutation. A mutation causes changes in the DNA message and corresponding changes to an individual's biology, to how their body works or how it looks. Right? So changes in the genetic message have meaning. Right? They change the meaning of the message, which changes the biology of the organism. So we'll have entire lectures devoted to DNA later in the term. Just a very quick overview. There are 4 building blocks of DNA, and you can see those on the left there. There's adenine, those are the A's of the genetic message. Thymine are the T's of the genetic message. Cytosine are the C's, and guanine are the G's. So these are the 4 molecular letters of the genetic code, and they get strung together in different patterns to create unique words whose meaning produces all the biological features of a living creature. 2 of these strings of words wind around each other in a spiral shape known as a double helix, which you can see on the right here. To understand how 4 letters, 4 molecules can code for such diversity of life as we see on this earth. Remember that computers can be driven by a binary code, which is just 1s and 0s. That's just 2 symbols. Instead of binary, this is a quaternary code, so there are even more possibilities. Now, during cellular reproduction, the DNA code is copied letter by letter to offspring. And a mutation is when a letter is copied incorrectly, causing the message to change. Now, even though so far it looks like there is one common ancestor to all life on Earth, as far as we can tell, that ancestor diversified into 3 main lineages, which we call domains. So all life on Earth falls into one of these 3 domains. We have bacteria, and bacteria and archaea are the cells they're made out of are called prokaryotic cells. They're single cells. You are made up of trillions of cells, but a bacteria is just one cell, right? And an archaea is just one cell. And these cells are very tiny and especially simple. They're very basic. They're like a cell membrane. And inside that cell membrane is some fluid and some DNA and some tools to maintain life. And that's it. It's just as basic as it gets, right? So bacteria and archaea are very simple cells, and they're all single-celled organisms. Eukarya are a little more complex. They're made of bigger cells with extra bells and whistles. They've got all these fancy compartments on the inside that are specialized for different functions. And eukarya can be, some eukarya are single-celled. We call them protists, single-celled protists or algae. And some are multicelled, like you. So anything you can see is multicellular, made up of many cells. So that's going to be things like fungi, animals, plants. Those are all multicellular organisms. So everything you see is eukarya, and everything you don't see is bacteria, archaea, or eukarya. Now, bacteria and archaea may superficially look the same because, I mean, how many ways can a single cell look, right? Not so many ways. It's just like a ball. So superficially, they look similar, but they're in different domains because their chemistry is different. Their lifestyle is different. So they are actually as different from each other as they are from you and me. So the majority of living things on Earth are single-celled. We know little about the dominant domains on this planet for the simple reason that they are too small to see. Our intuition for them is very poor. They have no sex. I mean, they have no sex as in many of them don't even have sexual reproduction, but many of them don't even have male-female. Like, they don't have sexual identities, right? They may not breathe oxygen. They may not need sugars. They may instead harvest strange forms of energy from thermal vents, from strange chemicals. They may as well be alien life, yet they are everywhere. Some of them have like 10,000 sexes, actually, like in fungi. So there's very bizarre forms of life on this, our very own planet, and we just don't think about them much because they're hard to see. All right, so here's just, some pictures of some of the diversity of life on Earth. In general, the more similar two organisms, the more similar their DNA. So plants share a lot of DNA with each other, and they have less DNA in common with other eukaryotes like animals, and even less DNA in common with prokaryotic cells like bacteria or archaea. So the differences in DNA, which arise through mutation, account for diversity within a species and across species. So the diversity of life on Earth arises through differences in DNA, which arises through mutations over time. So evolution means change over time. Anything can evolve by this definition, right? Music evolves, religions evolve, ideas evolve, civilizations evolve, inasmuch as these things change over time. But the biological definition of evolution is more specific. It means change in trait frequency over time. And I know that sounds jargony, so let's break it down. A trait is a physical feature, right? Frequency is how often you see it. So a change in trait frequency over time would just mean that evolution means some traits become more common in a population over time and some become more rare in a population over time. We can also say the definition for evolution is descent with modification. So things that already exist become slowly modified over time. And that, again, is through mutation. So you could say evolution can be defined as the process of change that has transformed life on Earth from its earliest beginnings to the diversity of organisms living today. And this is where diversity comes in and why it is important. Diversity means that when conditions on the planet change, like weather or food sources, some individuals might have the traits required for survival. And these traits may have been rare in the original population, but individuals who carry them will survive in the new conditions. They'll procreate, and so those traits eventually become more common. And the species persists by changing what most of the individuals are like. If everyone's exactly the same, then when the environment changes, if one individual can't survive the change, then nobody survives the change. But if you have diversity, maybe a few individuals, even though they might not be very common, maybe a few have a trait that's useful in the new conditions. And so diversity in a population increases the probability that instead of going extinct, a species will evolve as conditions in its environment change over time. Now, evolution is not directed by the evolving organism, right? An individual by themselves cannot evolve. Diversity in DNA exists in a population to begin with. Environmental conditions and changes select which organisms pass on their DNA to a new generation, right? So you can't say to yourself, oh, the condition changed, I'm going to change my DNA, right? You can't do that, and no other organism on our planet does that. Evolution is not an easy process. It involves death and destruction. It's what happens when something changes in a stressful way, and it changes which individuals are surviving and which are not surviving. So when you get that overturning of who's reproducing and who's not reproducing, it's stressful. There's usually a lot of stress involved, and a lot of individuals are dying, and the ones who remain are that next generation is going to look like whoever's reproducing, right? And so there's this slow shift towards the favored traits in the population. So there is evidence for evolution, right? There's artificial selection, there's homology, there's the fossil record, and there's direct observation, and you'll need to know these for the exam. So let's go through them one by one. All right. Artificial selection. Artificial selection is a little bit like natural selection, except instead of the environment dictating which individuals pass on their genes to the next generation and which don't, humans are deciding which individuals pass on their genes and which don't. So you can think about dog breeding, you can think about crops, any kind of crop. So dogs, crops, cattle, these domesticated animals and crops are not like the plants and animals we find in the wild. Instead of nature deciding which traits get passed on, humans decide. And humans are not always choosing traits that can survive in the wild on their own. So many domesticated crops and domesticated animals can no longer live without the artificial environments that humans produce. Okay. So what humans do in artificial selection is we take the most valued traits and we breed only those, and new generations will be more desirable from a human standpoint than the previous generations. So here with this corn, you can see that humans have selected the biggest corn, the plumpest corn, the most sugary corn, and over many generations, the corn becomes plumper, sweeter, juicier, more sugary, right? So in this previous slide, you can see what the original wild corn looks like, and over time we've made corn look the way we see it in the supermarket. All right, homology. So that was artificial selection. We've been able to cause evolution to happen intentionally to benefit us. Now homology. Homology is the similarity of traits in different organisms due to descent from the same trait in a common ancestor. So you can see that in the human, the cat, the whale, the bat, we all have the same bones. The bones may have changed proportions in these different organisms, but all the same bones are there in the human, cat, whale, and bat. And there's no reason for that. There's no reason to have fingers in a bat wing or in a whale flipper. And yet they're all there. All the same bones are there, just different lengths than they are in the human, right? So this is a product of common ancestry, different lineages of which encounter different environmental pressures. there is one common ancestor that wasn't a human, wasn't a cat, wasn't a whale, wasn't a bat, but it had 5 fingers. And in each of these lineages, the bones very gradually over time altered in their proportions and length to suit the different environmental stresses that each of these different lineages encountered. So these are echoes of a time past and evidence of a common ancestor between these 4 lineages. Fossil record. In this picture, you can see an excavation of fossilized mammoth bones. The fossil record shows us that the biosphere is not static, but rather it's always changing. There are animals alive today that once did not exist. They're not represented in the fossil record. And animals in the fossil record are shown to have existed at one time that cannot be seen anywhere on the planet today. So the fossil record shows that species come and go on the planet. Species come and go as the environmental conditions change. You can line it up with environmental changes. So those species that do not have traits that allow them to survive in new conditions on the planet, they die off. They go extinct. The species that are able to survive will undergo gradual changes to adapt to the new conditions, as very specific traits get passed to new generations while other traits disappear from the population due to environmental pressures selecting which individuals reproduce and which do not. The result over eons is the emergence of new species. We can also track homologies in the fossil record and see how certain biological forms gradually change over time. We can track the progression of evolution of one species into another by fossilized bones and sometimes even fossilized leaves and skin that we find in the soil and in rock. So soil is built from degradation of rocks and decomposition of dead animals and dead plants. New soil is always deposited on the top of old soil. So as you dig, the deeper you dig, the older the soil becomes and the farther back in time you go. Okay. If different extinct body patterns were randomly distributed in the Earth's crust, then that would be a mark against the theory of evolution. However, what we see as we dig down in rock and dirt is a gradual transition in body plans over time, organized by age of the surrounding rock, which suggests that animals didn't magically appear and disappear. Biological forms didn't magically appear and disappear. They changed gradually with their environment. One time, the biologist Dr. Haldane was asked whether the theory of evolution was falsifiable. He was challenged to imagine what kind of data would refute the theory of evolution. And his response was rabbits in the Precambrian. Now, the Precambrian includes the time on Earth before life appeared, through the evolution of microbes, through the first soft-bodied creatures to the first hard-shelled creatures. There were no life forms with hard skeletons yet in the Precambrian. There were no cartilaginous fish even. There were certainly no rabbits. What he meant, of course, was that any evidence that biological forms do not change gradually over time would refute the theory of evolution. If the appearance of new biological forms was completely random in the fossil record, with new forms suddenly arising and disappearing with no pattern at all with age of rock, that would be evidence against evolution. Because remember, evolution is descent with modification. So a modification of existing structures slowly over time, not the magical and inexplicable appearance and disappearance of biological features. But what we see in the fossil record is descent with modification. And so this goes back Precambrian. So again, as you dig down the rocks, if you look at this picture, so if you start at the surface, you have the most recent creatures on the planet. And as you go back, you can see more and more ancient forms of life, more and more primitive forms of life. And at the very bottom, you have the Precambrian. What you see in the Precambrian is not rabbits, right? So finally, we come to direct observation. Now, in many organisms on the planet, evolution is difficult to observe in real time because it happens so slowly. So if you're going to have descent with modification, how are you going to observe evolution in humans? It's not easy because it happens over the course of hundreds of generations, and we're only alive for one generation. Even hundreds of generations of rabbits is hard to observe, and hundreds of generations might be fast for evolution. But when it comes to microbes, we can observe it very easily because microbes reproduce, they make a new generation every few minutes, every few seconds, at most every couple hours, every couple days. Okay. So if you have a new generation every day, it takes 100 days to get 100 generations. And most microbes reproduce even more quickly than that. So we can observe evolution very easily in the microbial world. HIV, great example. HIV is constantly evolving inside a single patient's body so fast. Drugs that worked, they stop working not because the patient has changed, but because the virus has evolved. The virus, the drug killed all the drug susceptible, weak virus. The ones that survived are the ones that reproduced, and the next generation became more like them. And so over time, the viral load in the patient's body becomes completely drug resistant. This is one of the reasons HIV is so hard to treat. It reproduces so rapidly and evolves so rapidly that a patient can go through all the drugs available on the market and the virus will evolve resistance to every single one of them. Okay, MRSA, which stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, but now it really should be called multi-drug resistant Staphylococcus aureus. This is just staph. You used to be able to treat staph with penicillin. Now, not only is it resistant to penicillin and methicillin and vancomycin, it's resistant, many strains of MRSA are resistant to so many drugs that it can be very difficult to treat. We didn't used to worry about staph with the invention of penicillin because, again, antibiotics apply a stress where the weakest in the face of that stress die, the strongest survive, the ones that survive reproduce, the next generation becomes more like them. And over time, the resistance genes spread through the population and the population evolves. It's not because individuals changed, it's because the ones that weren't adapted to an antibiotic-filled environment already died. And those that were strong in an antibiotic-filled environment procreated. And we've watched that happen in real time. All right, plants and herbicide. Plants and insects commonly evolve resistance to chemicals, which is why farmers today must apply much greater quantities of chemicals than they had to when herbicides and pesticides were first developed. When herbicides and pesticides were new, they worked like a charm. Now, they're so expensive because you just have to keep applying more and more and more because they already killed off all the pests that were susceptible, and only the ones that could survive in the face of this chemical onslaught reproduced and had offspring, and their offspring are more resistant. They need a stronger dose to kill them. Flu. Even the flu, a well-accepted example by everyone who gets a flu shot. The reason you have to get a flu shot every year is because the flu changes. So previous vaccines are no longer effective. SARS-CoV-2. Here we are in the middle of the COVID pandemic. It's always changing, right? It's always in the news. New strains. Where did they come from? It mutated. That's evolution. And over time, certain strains with their unique traits become more common over time while others become less common over time. That is the definition of evolution. Change in trait frequency over time. Descent with modification. It's not new viruses popping up. It's the same virus, slightly altered. Now everyone in the news is talking about evolution. We've all accepted it when it comes to SARS-CoV-2 because we see it all the time around us. So mutations are random. They happen randomly across the genome and over time. Natural selection is not random. It is directed by the environment. The environment chooses which mutations get passed to the next generation. Any environmental condition can influence which traits are favored or disfavored in a species. Predators, mate selection, temperature, anything that's a little bit stressful is going to differentially preference certain traits in the species over others. There's this great video that you will watch for this class in this unit about pocket mice in the Valley of Fire of New Mexico. This is research on evolution of pocket mice. And these pocket mice, they're all one species, but they're pale tan where they exist in the desert, and they are dark black on lava flows. So there are these little lava flow islands where all the mice are dark. Again, camouflage with the lava flow. And the interesting thing is that these lava flows are so many miles apart that the dark mice can't travel. They can't travel from one lava flow to another. And yet, all the mice on every single lava flow are dark. Now, there are a lot of genes involved in coat color. So there are a number of mutations that could result in darker coats. If these mice were all designed to be black, we would expect the same design, the same genetic code to be found in each of them. But instead, what we find are that the mutations causing the black color are different on each lava flow. And this shows that black mutations happened more than once, each time in a different way, because mutations are random. Mutations are random, but natural selection is not random. If there are 10 mutations that could result in a black coat, you would expect all of these mutations to happen by random chance eventually, given enough time and given enough mouse babies, right? But they only persist where they're useful. Natural selection was inferred by connecting two observations. There's individual variation, so individuals in a population vary in their traits, many of which are passed on from parents to offspring, right? And overproduction of offspring. A population can produce far more offspring than the environment can support. From these observations, the famous Darwin drew two inferences: unequal reproductive success. That's individuals with heritable traits best suited to the environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than less well-suited individuals. And accumulation of favorable traits over time. As a result of unequal reproductive success over many generations, an increasing proportion of individuals in a population will have the advantageous traits, right? Darwin gets all the credit for this idea, but many researchers were coming to the same conclusions at the same time. The data were all pointing in this direction. So just to clarify this, there's diversity in the population, that's point one. Everybody's different. Moths may all look the same to you, but they do have genetic variation. They do have diverse populations. And everybody produces more offspring than will survive. So not all the offspring are going to survive. Which survive? The ones with the most advantageous traits. And that's responsible for evolution. Over time, you get an accumulation of individuals with the advantageous trait. Let's look at another This is another direct observation of evolution. So this is the peppered moth. In the 1800s, it looked primarily like this. The darker version was never seen until the early to mid 1800s. It was much more rare. Can you see why? Now, its predator is a bird. Birds are visual predators, so they will preferentially eat things that are easy to see. Now, the background of the peppered moth looks something like you see on the bottom there. It is in its natural habitat, the gray peppered moth is better camouflaged. The dark one stands out, right? But what happened in the early 1800s? In the 1800s was the Industrial Revolution. Coal was a big part of that. Air quality plummeted over the course of the 1800s. Coal soot was everywhere, including on all the trees surrounding Manchester. The dark allele was rare at the beginning of the 1800s. Which alleles do you think were common and which were rare by the end of the 1800s? Right? I mean, look at that sooty tree. Who's camouflaged now? The dark one's camouflaged now. Who was surviving and having the most offspring in the new, changed environment? The dark moth. The dark allele was rare at the beginning of the 1800s, and it became common because by the end of the 1800s, only the dark moths were reproducing because all the light moths now were getting eaten because they were no longer camouflaged with the new environment. I want to quickly recap how humans use evolution in everyday life. We selectively breed plants and animals in the process of artificial selection to produce more productive crops. better livestock, and a great variety of pets that bear little resemblance to our wild ancestors. That's us leveraging evolution to direct it in the direction we want it to go. Humans also unintentionally cause the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria and the evolution of pesticide-resistant pests and herbicide-resistant weeds. There's a couple of videos that talk about evolution of microbes. I've already talked about the evolution of HIV. In that video, you'll see how the field of medicine can leverage an understanding of evolution to come up with better remedies, better therapies for people who are sick with diseases like HIV that evolve so rapidly. And also, evolution of drug resistance and tuberculosis. I'd like you to watch that video. There's an extra credit activity on it. And that video discusses how, again, we need to leverage our understanding of evolution to provide better treatments and to prevent the evolution of superbugs.